All right, so many of you are pretty familiar with the situation. It's looking pretty dire for ash in Minnesota. So EAB first came onto the scene back in sometime in the late 1990s. It was actually discovered in 2002, 2003, 4, somewhere in there. But it had been in the United States for a bit before it was discovered. So in the Detroit area is where it first established, and then this is kind of where it's at today. So this map that you see here, I just downloaded. It was updated February 1st. You can see largely covers most of the eastern U.S. And certainly up into portions of Minnesota as well. Now, the reason it's so dire, of course, is really no biological defensive mechanisms in ash to EAB, and so as the larvae feed on the inner phloem, it eventually girdles the tree. You get individual tree deaths within anywhere between 2 and 3 years. Entire stands within somewhere between 4 and 7 years. And so, again, really not looking good for ash. There have been a lot of discussions lately about the really severe cold that we've had, how much that'll influence the spread of EAB, and this is way outside my area of expertise, but I've talked to some people who indicate it's still going to be a pretty dire situation. It might slow it down a little bit, maybe some other factors that'll slow it down, but by and large, the bug will spread and ash will likely die. All right, so what we focus on today is very much on black ash. So in Minnesota, we have 3 species of ash. We have white ash, which are part of northern upland forests. We have green ash, which typically occur in floodplains, and then our black ash wetlands, which is the piece that we're focused on. And the reason why we focused in on black ash is for a couple of reasons. The first is just really extensive. So we estimate somewhere around 1 million acres or so of the stand cover type in Minnesota. And also just because it's really unique in terms of its composition, where it's almost, in many instances, almost pure stands. Certainly upwards of 50% of the composition is composed of black ash, oftentimes much higher than that, anywhere from 80 to 90%. And so when you take a forest that's composed of one species that's likely to die over some period of time in the coming future, we think that the impacts will likely be pretty large. So kind of just hammering that home, this is some work from Tony D'Amato and his group where they went out and surveyed a bunch of old growth black stands. And so what you're looking at here is age of recruitment, where they did some dendrochronology on the panel in the upper portion. The main thing to take away from that is the black ash, which is shown in black there, is essentially continuously in the stand composition throughout the development of the stand history. And so this really points to kind of gap phase dynamics where you get small maybe openings being established from wind throw events, and black ash that's within the understory then grows up and replaces the trees that die. And so really just, again, hammers home kind of the strong influence that black has on overall structural composition. Then we can look at the mix of species. So again, as I pointed out before, black ash is the main player there. So the black bars, certainly upwards of 60, 70% across all those stands. There's obviously a handful of other species present, some which you typically probably associate with the black ash stands, things like red maple. American elm would have typically been a very big piece in these stand compositions. Of course, with Dutch elm disease now, that's kind of getting hit with a 1-2 punch here. But there is a mix of other species that are present, but the vast majority is black ash. And so because of that, we think of it as being really a foundational species in controlling ecosystem functions. And the piece that I've been focusing on, and the one that we've really focused in on in general in terms of having a big driver in terms of what the response might be, is site hydrology. Right? So these are wetland forests. They're strongly controlled by the various hydrologic conditions, the hydro periods that exist within those forests. What I'm showing you here is a hydrograph showing the water table dynamics over the course of one season. This is from one of our sites I'm talking about here today. First thing to point out is you can see that for the vast majority of the early spring season, all the way up until about mid-June or so, the water table is either at or above the ground surface. So you have areas of ponded water. But then you get this relatively rapid drawdown that occurs in sometime in the area of June, July. That corresponds with leaf out of black ash. And so when we see this, we start to really hammer home and think about the role that biology plays on this hydrology. And we start to look at really finer scales, we can see that pretty clearly. And so what you're seeing now is the same pattern for water tables, just on a daily time step. And so you can see during daylight hours, you get this pretty dramatic drawdown. It's associated with transpiration. Then at nighttime, you get either a slight rise or stability in the water table. And this is just a really clear signal of the role that biology plays on hydrology in these wetlands. Because of black ash is such a large chunk of the composition of those stands, really highlights the role that black ash plays on hydrology. So if you lose black ash, what happens at hydrology, cascading effects, and so on. All right, so our overriding objective of the entire team, when we started out, of course, we're interested in a lot of the basic science questions, just like all of you are, but our big one is just pretty simple in terms of what we're trying to do. And it's doing this, it's showing this picture, is we're trying to maintain these forested wetlands, as shown here on the picture on the left. Maybe not a forest of black ash, but a forest of trees, maintaining that in a forested condition, avoiding this situation on the right. We have maybe this more open water condition, more of a marsh-like type wetland, which might have benefits in and of itself, but it's not a forest, right? And this is Department of Forest Resources, so we like forests, and we want to maintain them, and that's why our overriding objective is what it is. So when we started out, there wasn't a lot of information related to this. So our work got started back in late 2010. The reason why was there's just not a lot of work that's been done in terms of silviculture with black ash, largely because it hasn't been a huge commercial species within the state. There was some work by Urban and others that was published back in the late 80s. And from that work, one of the key things that popped out was, again, related to site hydrology, where they had some anecdotal reports of sites after being clear cut, the water table rise, or causing the water table to rise or swamp out a site and actually causing conversion to more of this marsh-like condition. And so our big questions that we formulated around this were pretty simple. One is just, will the site hydrology be altered? We're pretty confident that it would be, but we wanted to really kind of confirm that with our observations. We wanted to figure out if doing nothing was a viable option, because we think it's likely that in many of the instances, the vast majority of our 1 million acres of black ash wetlands will not be managed for a variety of different reasons. And so if we do nothing, if we allow the bug to move through, kill the trees, what are the potential impacts associated with that? And then lastly is, in some situations, some certain types of conditions can we potentially mitigate some of those impacts. So can we do something with management in order to lessen the impact on things like water, wildlife, and so on. All right, so the primary experiment I'm talking about today was established up on the Chippewa National Forest. Chippewa National Forest has been a fantastic partner with us. They have a large amount of this cover type within the forest, and so they're very interested in what they can do from a management context to mitigate those impacts. One thing I will highlight is it's kind of unique in that it's not just that we have kind of this unique condition in Minnesota for the composition of black ash, but it's really driven towards more of the pure stand composition on those sites. So anywhere from between 80 and 95% of the stand composition was dominated by black ash. We did 4 different treatments. The first one was we went out and girdled all the trees, and this is to mimic EAB, right? So we're fortunate enough that we're doing this kind of ahead of time. EAB is not present. Well, it's kind of present now up in the Duluth area, but not widespread within the Northwoods yet. And so in order to just evaluate what that effect would be, we had to girdle all of the trees, similar to what the larvae do when they feed on the phloem. Second treatment was a clear-cut treatment, which at the time of when we established the experiment, we were thinking of trying to evaluate what a lot of managers were thinking about doing, and that was going out and liquidating the resource. And so we wanted to see what would happen when you did that. Now we're actually viewing this more as a longer-term response to EAB, where you just don't have any ash trees present, and so trying to assess what those long-term impacts are. The third treatment was a group selection treatment, where we removed 20% of the basal area in these small gaps. And the idea there being that if we could remove some of the sand area, we could potentially maintain the hydrology, so keep that water table stable, but at the same time open up gaps to allow other trees to get established, and essentially slowly convert the composition of the forest to something else. And last, of course, is a control. So this is a picture here, an aerial photo shortly after we established those treatment plots. With the lights on, you can't see it too well, but clearly, some clear cuts there. You definitely can't see it, but if we had a little bit of a darker room, there's some discoloration in a circle showing the effect of girdling in the first year. And then there's also those tiny little patches, which are the 0.1 acre group cuts. All right. So I just want to emphasize one key thing here. This is one hydrologic setting. It is a pretty unique situation where we have this confining layer, essentially these deep clays that perch the water table and have it be elevated near the soil surface compared to a lot of the other areas that we might see around the state, which are quite a bit different. Maybe small depressional ponds or transition zones between uplands and peatlands. And so these areas are strongly influenced with that shallow water table. Precipitation is the dominant water source, predominantly in terms of rain, but also some snow as well, as we all are familiar with being outside. And then lastly, there is some interflow between sites. I always get this question, well, hey, you did this management, how much does it influence the fact that you have, other intact forest right nearby in terms of your response? Yeah, water does move from one spot to another, but the relative amount that moves is actually quite low from a lot of our calculations. All right, so some pictures. This is always a fun one. Has anybody ever been out to this site? Seen it in person? A couple of people? Okay, it's pretty impressive. So again, so see, these are 4-acre replications. There's 8 of them for each treatment. So 32 acres of each treatment was established. So if you do the math, we had for the girdling treatment anywhere between 220 and 350 trees per acre. 32 acres, it's like 12,000 trees were manually girdled for this experiment. I didn't do any of that at all. We had technicians that did a fantastic job, and not only did they do it the one time, but we actually had them go out and do it a second time to ensure that we'd have complete mortality associated with that treatment. So the upper picture on the left there, that's immediately following. These were done in the winter. Picture on the upper right is the first year, or actually 2 years post-treatment, and then this picture on the bottom was a few years after, just demonstrating things are still growing back, but the composition is actually becoming quite different compared to some of our control stands. Then for the other 2 treatments, I just want to hammer home 2 things. One is that, of course, these were established during winter, so these are wetlands. We typically don't operate in wetlands during the summer conditions. And that year, in particular, when they were established, it was just really great operating conditions. We had really low snowpack, very, very cold nights, and so the amount of soil disturbance or impact that occurred during harvesting was very low. And the other thing is that for the clear cutting treatment, it was a true clear cut. There was nothing retained. You can see that every single stick of vegetation that was there prior was removed during the establishment of the harvest. Then, of course, pictures on the right, things grew back. And that's, again, about 2 years after the treatment. So even in these small gaps, there's trees that are starting to grow in and regenerate, and pretty prolific growth in the clear cut as well. For the trees, all these little bushes are stump sprouts from a lot of the stumps that were harvested. And there's some implications for that too that I'll mention in a bit. All right, so I'm just jumping right in. Again, so the water table, the hydrology is the big piece that I've been looking at. Starting off with a general response. So what we had is we had a well in the center of each one of those treatment plots. We were just measuring the water table dynamics over time. And what you're looking at here is mean weekly values for each one of those treatments, averaged across the 8 different replications. A few things to emphasize here. Well, one, first of all, is obviously with the colors, you can see the treatments. Hopefully, not too many issues with red, green, colorblind folks, but you have the symbols as well. For these asterisks, that just indicates there's a significant difference amongst the treatments during those time periods. So the first thing to emphasize is that there's clearly a treatment effect of the clear cut and the girdling treatment, and they match pretty closely to each other. So the water tables are elevated and near the soil surface for a longer period of time during the spring. Then you do get that drawdown that still occurs, but they actually stabilize at a much higher level than the control stand, which is shown there in that solid black. The other thing to emphasize is if you look at the group selection treatment, which is in that this grayish with the open circle here, there's really not a large treatment effect. The mean's higher than the control, but when we account for the pretreatment differences amongst the replications, there's actually no significant statistical effect. And so it's really achieving what we had hoped it to do with that group selection treatment, is that we only take out 20% of the stand area, the water table can be maintained and stay at that similar condition as the control. All right, so that was just this general response. And this one is actually specifically the 2 years following treatment. What we've also done then is, of course, continue to measure. And so what we have so far is we have 7 years of data. So the first year following treatment was in 2012. And what I'm showing you here now is instead of looking at the mean weekly water table response, you're looking at the water table relative to the control. And so if you're not familiar with looking at these, essentially any line that's above the black line means that things are wetter than they were prior to treatment. Any line that's below the black line, which is the control line, is dry. Okay? So if you look at these first years, we're really all the years through. You can see that in many instances, with the exception of the group selection treatment, the water tables are elevated. And they're similar to what I showed you with the general weekly mean response. What else is interesting, though, is if you look at these, you can see that the girdling treatment, which is in blue, actually has a more significant response than the clear cut in many of the years. And so essentially the girdling treatments have a more wetter response compared to what happens with the clear cut treatment. The other thing to emphasize, so this is 7 years of data, there's no evidence of recovery. So things are just maintaining the way in which they are in terms of the amount of wetness. And so that's the one thing that we're really honing in on in terms of implications for longer term response is that even over these first 7 years of reorganization of the stand following these experimental manipulations, hydrology is continuing to be influenced and altered in some way, which is not necessarily good news. All right, so what contributes to that? Well, I think most of you would say, well, obviously you killed the trees, that must have been one, and it certainly was. And so I was demonstrating that with leaf area. So these are some hemispherical photos. See on the left is a control stand, on the right is a girdling. So, in as much as leaves are the drivers of transpiration and water flux to the atmosphere, that's kind of the visual representation of what's probably a big factor that's driving that response. And so that's the obvious one, not just with the girdling treatment, but with the clear cutting as well. But there's the other thing is, if you remember, I said the girdling treatment has actually had more of a response. It was more wet in terms of how it responded compared to the clear cut treatment. And I think this is for one primary reason is, in the clear cut, of course, you removed all the trees, right? And so you have a big change in the microclimate. Versus if you think about the girdling treatment, you have all these dead standing trees. They're just kind of standing up in the air. Well, some of them are starting to fall now, but most of them are still standing up in the air. And so that dead standing wood is further altering the microclimate. It's intercepting light, it's reducing near surface evaporation. And so essentially what that dead standing wood does is make the a worst case scenario in terms of water response, where you have reductions in kind of offsetting effects of evaporation because near surface evaporation is lower than it is in the clear cut. Hopefully that made sense. Okay. All right, so now we're starting to move on as we see this generalized response. We always get the question from managers in particular, so what does this mean for my site? What should I be doing? Is my site going to swamp? Is it not going to swamp? Because even within our 8 replications that we had within that one little experimental area in the Chippewa, there was variation in response, like we always see in nature, right? That's the name of the game. So what we're starting to turn towards is looking at indicators now of what might be related to the response. And so some work done by Jake Diamond, who's a graduate student down at Virginia Tech. He's gone out and looked at a wider range of settings across northern Minnesota, so not just those expansive clay-dominated wetlands that we have in the Chippewa, but also a variety of other wetlands across northern Minnesota, and started to see how the hydrology in those sites relates to various things. And one of the things that he's keyed in on, which I think is pretty interesting, is that it turns out that the height of hummocks is strongly related to hydrology. So it's related to both the hydro period in terms of the number of days or waters above the ground surface, but it's also directly related to mean water table height. And so we can start to potentially use this type of information. You can tell a manager, we're not at this point yet, but our hope is that we can be able to tell a manager, well, if you have a hummock that's between, 10 and 20 centimeters compared to maybe ones that are really shallow or not even really that evident, you're going to have a much greater response compared to some other type of condition. So it's just an example of kind of where we're trying to go in the future with using this information to actually address the threat. Okay, and so for many of you, this won't be surprising as well. If you change the hydrology, it turns out that vegetation kind of responds to that as well. And so when things get more wet, the vegetation communities start to reflect that. And there's some great work done by this former graduate student here. Chris Looney did all the work on this project under Tony D'Amato and Brian. We went out and did a lot of different community analyses, trying to evaluate how distinctly different the treatments were amongst each other. I'm not showing you that data. If anybody knows me, they know how I feel about ordinations and the drawing of circles. So instead I'll just say they're different. And in particular, some pictures can really reflect that. This picture here in the upper right with the clear cut is really reflective of kind of one of the more common situations we have where we get a large amount of grass and sedges that are coming into the sites following these treatments. And think about a tree trying to grow in that, it's very challenging and very hard. So we don't have a lot of success. And again, really reflecting maybe to shift more of that marsh-like condition. But also even with the girdling treatment, we have established more grasses and sedges, but we also have some lowland shrub species, so more alders, maybe mountain maple, things that reflect more of that change in hydrology. So it's not just the change in water, but it's what that change does then to vegetation and ultimately what that does in terms of feedbacks. All right, so the last thing that we've been looking at then is tree regeneration, right? That's the big one. If we want to maintain a forest in a forested condition, it's probably pretty important to understand what's happening with the potential trees that could grow into that forest. And so what we've done is gone out and looked at all the different regeneration that's occurred within these treatments. And there's just a few things I want to highlight with this data. The first is there aren't that many other species that are growing back. So if you look at that list on the left, there's really only 6 species, one of them which is black ash, and of course black ash would be susceptible to EAB in an EAB world. And so really we're looking only at 5 potential species that could serve as replacement. There's a handful of others sprinkled in, but these are the big ones. The other thing is that if you remove the black ash, and remember a lot of that black ash is from stump sprouts, right? So after we cut the trees, the sprouts go up. Not even if it's not from a stump sprout, whether it's from seed, as soon as it gets up to about 1 inch in diameter, it's susceptible to EAB. So kind of remove that whole top line from your calculations in terms of how much regeneration is out there, and there really isn't a lot when you remove black ash. And so the main message there being overall natural regeneration is pretty low. But the other one, of course, is showing here with the circle in the girdling treatment. Again, that's a simulated EAB. We're kind of getting that really, really low levels of regeneration as well. And again, reflecting kind of the worst case situation, potentially an indicator of what's going to happen longer term when we have no ability to do management to address the impact. All right, we're going to attempt now to shift to the wildlife piece, which is great because you don't want to hear me talk about wildlife. I don't do it nearly the justice that Alexis does. So I'm going to hit.
Yep, mute yours. And Alexis, you're on.
Can you hear me? I can't hear you guys.
Yes, we can hear you.
So I'll just talk and then Rob, wave at me if you can't hear me. Huh? Okay. All right. So, so we came into this project 3 years ago, and because really everybody was asking the burning question, how does all of these changes to black ash actually influence wildlife? And one of the things is that when I started researching it is that nobody had really looked into how even wildlife were using black ash stands, let alone doing any research on EAB, because of course they're trying to figure out how to keep the forest trees still sort of standing. So what we wanted to do is, I don't think I can advance this. Somebody advance this slide. Thank you. Is ask the question, are wildlife communities in black ash wetlands actually unique? Because of course, if they are redundant with the upland communities that are mostly surrounding these black ash stands, I think we can make the case that wildlife would be fine. And so one of our first objectives were to just go out and do a complete survey of different taxa that are using the black ash stands. And so to do that, we looked at bird communities. And so what we wanted to do is look at these black ash wetlands in stands across northern Minnesota and compare them to the upland forests that were relatively close nearby. And then we also looked at amphibians. And we instead of looking at upland forests, we looked at emergent wetlands, which would be a similar community to really look at, again, are these forested wetlands unique in any way for these taxa? The surveys were conducted in 2017 and 2018, and for birds we used standard point and count surveys, and amphibians we used both call and larval surveys. And the results of the modeling I'm going to show you are just to annoy Rob, I guess, ordinations results of joint species distribution modeling. But I'll just sort of go over the graphics as it goes through here. So this is a result from the birds. And so if you want to click again, Rob, in the green, you're looking at the bird communities that are generally found in upland forests. And in the red circle, those are the bird communities that are generally found in the black ash stands. And so what you're sort of seeing is this visualization of there is some bird species that occur in both the black ash wetlands and the upland forests, but there is a significant difference in community composition and also abundance between these species. So the results of this ordination are that, yes, bird communities are actually quite unique. And this, again, was surprising because we had never done any surveys focusing on black ash wetlands. And so it was interesting to see these really unique composition of species that were really made up of species that were responding to that water component, but also old growth forest species that you don't see very commonly in some of these more typical upland forest stands. Amphibians, there's less species diversity, so less dots, but the emergent communities are significantly different from the forested wetland communities as well. And we do have a little bit of overlap, but again, strong evidence to suggest that wetlands, forested wetlands provide unique communities for amphibians as well. So overall, when we just look at the overall community metrics, both species richness and species diversity were higher in black ash stands compared to the neighboring upland communities. And so, again, this was a bit of a surprise, but these black ash communities are basically little pockets of wildlife hotspots in terms of biodiversity and also abundance. So then we wanted to use the experimental stands to ask, how will EAB then influence wildlife communities? And so we used the stands in Chippewa that Rob was talking about to compare the bird communities in the experimental treatments. And then we also looked here for the small mammal communities. And again, these data were collected 2017, 2018. And we used small mammal traps in the fall to look at those little guys. And again, we used joint species distribution modeling to analyze the data. And so for small mammals, we see a really big shift in small mammal communities from the control to the clear cuts. So in that red circle there, you're looking at all the different species that are found in really these forested wetlands. And in the green, you're looking at the clear cut. And in the yellow, we're seeing sort of a combination of the girdled and the group selection, where there are a few species that are responding to the open canopy. The big thing is notice that there's no overlap here in the red and the clear cut. And again, we're sort of treating the clear cut as the future conditions if we do nothing for wildlife. And it really shifts what small mammals are using or even going to be found in any of these habitats to something completely different and relatively unique for a forested ecosystem. So our results, EAB will change small mammal communities. But most people don't care necessarily about mice, but more people do care about martens and wolves and all these sorts of things. And so we also looked at medium to large mammals using camera traps out in these experimental stands. And what you're seeing is, I know you guys are forestry people, so maybe don't know much about wildlife, but a lot of them are really forest-dependent species. Things like American marten, fisher, even deer are all found significantly more often in the control stands compared to the clear cut. And so really what that's telling us is that these medium to large mammals are avoiding these little 4-acre pockets of open area as they're moving through the landscape. And so as EAB comes and these black ash die and turns to emergent, really we're losing a lot of connectivity between the forested habitats for these large mammals. And of course that people care quite a bit about things like wolves and marten and fisher and some of these game species. So again, if you think about that 1 million acres of black ash that's on the landscape up here in northern Minnesota, and you start thinking about it as sort of these holes in this forested ecosystem as just like little Swiss cheese and how the animals have to navigate around it, it could be really a potential issue for these larger mammals. And then birds, again, we see something very similar where in the first circle, you'll see the unique forested wetlands. And then there's sort of a nice gradient and shift in bird communities from the group selection where it's unique, but it still overlaps with the control. And here we have the girdled and then finally the clear cut. And we're seeing this complete shift from forest-dependent species to some species that use more of the open gap canopies to basically swamp species or species that you might see on the side of the road in a wet ditch or something is really what's in the green circle. So there's a loss of ecological integrity of that ecosystem based on the indicator of birds. So this is concerning because there is that complete changeover in bird communities when EAB comes.
Good to go.
Good to go. All right. We didn't practice that at all, and I just went, did you see how I was doing really good with this? Thank you, Alexis. There wasn't a dig at you not knowing wildlife. We all know everybody knows their wildlife. So. Alexis is great at jokes. So one of the main other things that we wanted to do, of course, was to address this question of mitigation. And so, I've already presented a little piece of that with the group selection treatment. It maintains hydrology, so potentially we could be using that to slowly alter composition. But the other big piece that we've been looking at is seeing whether or not we can establish some alternative tree species and be able to actually help along that compositional shift rather than just letting nature kind of run its course. And so what we did was we went out and planted 12 different species. I have here shown on this list on the left. Most of them are kind of similar ones that you might expect to, being those minor components within black ash stands, but we also have a handful of other species that probably wouldn't commonly have been planted. And these in particular are a couple from more southern seed zones, so hackberry and swamp white oak. And then also we have this one circled in green here, Manchurian ash, which is a non-native species. And the reason we are looking at Manchurian ash is in particular some of the tribes were very interested in understanding whether or not that could survive and do okay, because it was rumored to have some characteristics or qualities similar to black ash and potentially be used for basket weaving in the future. Still not sure if that's the case or not. Anyways, we went out and went and planted these and assessed their response. I always get the question, why didn't you do silver maple? I don't know. We just didn't do silver maple. But there's other people that are looking at it. And hopefully in the future we'll have some better indicators and ideas of what species will really do well. Okay, so again, we went out and we planted these in each of the different treatments. And the first thing to point out, looking at that figure on the left, is that survival overall was pretty low. So if you look across those, certainly there's some differences. The clear cut had some of the lowest survival. Think back to all the sedge and grass that's growing. Getting a tree to survive and with all that competition is pretty challenging. And so survival is even lower in the clear cut compared to the other treatments. But even those other ones, very low. 30% or lower in terms of overall survival. From a forest management standpoint, that's pretty much a total failure in terms of trying to establish a forest following a disturbance events like some of the management actions or simulated EAB. But the other thing is then you can look at the individual species. Of course, there's some variation within them. And so these are ranked, you can't see the numbers, but from top to bottom, they go from highest starting at American elm, and that's actually a DED resistant elm that we've been assessing, all the way down to yellow birch, which had possibly 3% survival rate across the board, which just really not very promising for yellow birch. But we did have some pretty decent success. So if you look in particular some of those maybe slightly unique species, so the Manchurian ash, the hackberry, and swamp white oak all did pretty good. Balsam poplar did pretty well as well. Some of the ones that we commonly see, more commonly co-occurring, things like tamarack, white cedar, they didn't do so well. Okay, so survival is one side of the coin. We also wanted to look at growth, and this is a little bit different in terms of once things got established, they tend to do very well where resources were most favorable. So in terms of the clear-cut treatment, where you had lots of abundant sunlight, clearly lots of water, if they were able to survive that initial wetting up that occurred in those treatments, survival or growth rather, was actually quite high within the clear-cut treatments compared to the control. And this is largely probably related to differences in light availability. I also have here for just treatment-specific effects, and of course we have these for each one of the different treatments, but I'm showing you here the group selection treatment as an example. There was differences within the treatments themselves. So here in this treatment, balsam poplar actually had some of the highest growth rates. Tamarack and cottonwood swamp white oak did pretty well as well. And so if you match that up with the survival numbers I just showed you, they're kind of opposite, and they aren't really matching up. So in other words, things that did pretty good in terms of their survival didn't have very good growth. Things that did pretty poorly overall in terms of survival, if they got established, grew very well. So it's all about whether or not you can actually get them established and growing. And so based on this, overall, when you combine all those, we've been pushing balsam poplar as potentially in a short-term kind of alternative for trying to slowly transition the stands, and swamp white oak is maybe a longer-term solution, at least based on our data. There's lots of other species as well, but a potential longer-term solution in terms of converting composition from something other than black ash. All right, so if you take it all together, we've shown pretty clearly there's impacts on hydrology in terms of water, there's impacts to vegetation in terms of different vegetation communities that are responding to those changes in hydrology, and also potential impacts on wildlife. And so if your goal is to mitigate impacts, doing nothing and just allowing EAB to move through these forests isn't really necessarily a good alternative to be pursuing. And so for various reasons, as I mentioned before, there's 1 million acres within in the state. We're not going to be able to treat them all, but if we can identify potentially high impact areas, we can potentially mitigate some of those impacts. The key there, of course, is finding which ones might have some of those really high impacts, but also identifying which sites you could potentially be successful at slowly converting the composition to something other than ash. And as much as we can find those situations, it seems like a group selection strategy. As we showed, and maybe it's not 20%. 20% was the amount that we removed from the forest. Maybe it's actually 30% or 40%. Maybe it's not small circles. Maybe it's strip cuts. But something where you're retaining some amount of the original stand composition to maintain hydrology. That combined with the planning strategy, long-term would probably be our best bet in terms of approaching and trying to mitigate the impact. All right, so this is the last one. I said this before, but I just hammer it home. We do have a lot of ash in Minnesota. So this is actually work that Trevor Host has been putting together using some remote sensing techniques to try and predict where black ash is in the state. And you can see, well, ash in the state with the vast majority of this being black ash. It's kind of everywhere, right? And there's quite a bit of it. 1 million acres, you can say the number when you see a picture of it, it kind of really hammers home that point. And so at the same time, if you're not familiar with what we do with black ash in terms of commodities or markets, there's really not many opportunities there. Sure, some people can use it for niche products, maybe for some flooring, pallets and things, but it's nothing like any of the other demand that we have for some of our most common species like aspen and so on. So we got this combination of we have a lot of ash, maybe some potential to mitigate, but at the same time, nobody wants to utilize the ash. And so it's kind of a disconnect in terms of what we're going to be able to do from a practical standpoint in terms of management. And so just thinking about how we move forward in terms of addressing that, we can use some of this information, maybe be a little bit more strategic in terms of what species we're planting, where we're doing the management that we're doing, to potentially still have some level of impact going forward. All right, as always, many others are involved, and this is only probably the short list. Certainly the guys who did a lot of the girdling of the trees, who have the big buff upper body strength now. Mitch Slater and Doug Kasnick did a lot of that work. Alan Tucholowski's been intimately involved in this work. Jake Diamond, Melissa Youngquist does a lot of the work with the wildlife and the amphibian data. And then, of course, Chris Looney, as I showed you all that vegetation data and some of the results from his planting work. And we've been funded almost entirely by the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund for all this. If there's any time for questions, I'd be happy to take any. Maybe we can even get Alexis somehow to chime in on questions as well.
Yeah. We've got, while people here think about questions, we've got 2 online. First one that came in is, any idea? Oh, sure. I mean, if you like to talk, I guess you can. Any idea why there was only 4% survival of cottonwood? The mic is not muted.
Yeah. No, I mean, when we talk about the species, my biggest thing with when we did the planting, we just threw this trees out there, right? And that's a really harsh environment to have only 30% survival across the board. So it could be anything, right? Browse, it could have been competition. And that's really what we're hoping to transition to for our next phase of the work, is really looking at what types of more active management can we do to improve establishment. Because if you can get them established, especially the ones that had good growth once you got them established, then potentially we can have some success in terms of changing the composition. But specific to cottonwood, no.
Okay. Another question from Bemidji. Does Rob have any examples of ash managed in conjunction with adjacent stands? Is there an increased response of aspen sprouting in an adjacent ash stand when managed together?
It's a great question. Marcella, Women at Campione, Matt Russell, myself, and the work that Trevor's been doing. Marcella's actually just summarized a bunch of that data. So when you have, and this is from a whole different set of plots beyond the ones I've talked about here today. But when you do have a component of aspen in the stand or nearby, yes, potentially you can. And that can actually be a real viable situation where if you have those types of conditions and you know that you have an aspen component, that would be a viable candidate to convert the composition. At least from all the data that we've seen so far, it seems like they do very well when it's present. So yes. Yeah.
I have some questions about the seedlings or saplings you planted. What size of trees were you planting? Where did you get the stock from? Did you think at all about sort of, seed zones or any of that kind of consideration moving forward?
Yeah. Yes. I didn't do so much of that heavy thinking, but there was a lot of thought that went into it. You had a lot of questions there. So in terms of the size of the stock, there was quite a bit of variability. So like our DED resistant elms, they were actually potted. That was what we could get from the Forest Service. And so that probably had a lot to do with their higher levels of survival. But other than that, most of it was from nursery stock, so bare root stock that was planted would have been 2.0 seedlings. But one of the things that we have, and maybe this is going off of the type of question you're asking, is one thing we've been looking at is things related to that. So seedling size in particular, not just from our work, but from a lot of others' works as well. It seems like everything that's much bigger just does a lot better. And so we might have to think differently about how we go about planting, not using those itty bitty little 2.0 seedlings that we typically use. We'd be starting to use maybe 4.0 stock, which is just not done. But it might ultimately have a better success in terms of getting establishment going. Is that?
Yeah, I guess like where you were getting your nursery stock from.
So if I recall, and I don't even want to give you false information. Can I just get back to you on that? Okay. So some of it we got from the Forest Service. I think some of it was from. We did use zones that would have been approved by the Forest Service, with the exception of like Manchurian ash, of course. We had to get that from like a private nursery. But let me get back to you on the details on those. Yeah, Rob.
So Rob, I'm curious about the early black ash, and how many of those are still standing? When green ash dies, it becomes very brittle very quickly and tends to fall over. Does the same thing happen with black ash?
Well, in terms of its brittleness, I'm not entirely sure, but there is. So we're 8 years in now. We've got maybe last time I was out there's maybe only about 15% of the trees have actually fallen over. So we're starting to get to that point now where it probably within the next couple of years is really this critical time where it's all going to start falling over, especially, after this winter, maybe a good amount already came down or some heavy windstorms. But more standing than you would expect. And I don't know why that is, if it's physical characteristics of the wood itself or what, but there is still a lot of it standing up. Mike?
How long do you plan to continue to monitor these different treatments over time?
As long as we can get money to do so. So the plan, right now, so the funding from the trust fund goes through 2020, and then we're going to put in another request for this round. So
that will give you how many years of post-treatment going through 2020?
2020 would be 9 years, because we had a year spin-up time, and they're 5-year blocks for each one, so 9 years. Maybe 8 years. 8 years, actually, of the post-treatment, because we have 1 year pre-treatment data. John?
So how do you convey, or what's your primary message to a landowner having the same kind of ecosystem? How do you change their behavior?
Well, I guess the main question is, do they truly want to work? If you're talking about a private landowner in particular, if they really want to maintain a forest, if you take, I'm from New York, I'm a pessimist at heart. That's just what I'm brought up in from being a New Yorker. And so, well, it's not just that too. We have lots of evidence that we just don't have a lot of success in these types of things. So if they really want to maintain a forest, they're gonna have to work at it. And so I think if you look combining kind of some of the information we have, if you do some type of partial removal in terms of group selection or strip cut or something to open up the stand to allow enough light in to get some other species established, and then combining that with a planting strategy could potentially work, but it's going to be some money put into it. I've just found out even when they can sell ash, and this is very rare that they can even sell the sales, they get $6 to $7 a quart. That's nothing. There's no financial incentive.
I'm just kind of talking about the reality.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's I'm trying to hammer home. It's pretty bleak. It's pretty bleak for all those reasons.
Rob, I got a couple questions online. One I know comes up frequently. Have you considered the possible impacts of introducing another non-native species such as Manchurian ash? Also, if this species is considered, I would consider consulting with tribes since it is an important cultural species.
Yeah, we talked about that, and we kind of sidestepped that whole ethical issue, and we just said we would remove them all before they became sexually viable. So, and that's still the plan. So before the Manchurian ash can reproduce, they will be removed. I think right now from our initial findings, there's really no plans to go forward in using it as a potential replacement. It's not doing very well. Early survival was okay. Its growth was horrible. And even now, from some of our later data, more than what I've shown you here today, the survival is not doing very well either. but no, we didn't. I mean, people grapple with that all the time, right? For like the biological control, introducing parasitoids that potentially could kill the bug, but at the same time, what's the unintended consequences of those things? And yeah, we took the easy way out and just said we would try and avoid actually introducing it. We were just testing to see if it could do okay. Yeah.
I have a question maybe for Alexis.
Okay.
Just if there were any wildest species in greatest conservation need in Minnesota, or if there are any species that were regionally have a special like conservation concern or status that would that are using black ash swamps.
Did she hear on that? Possibly.
Alexis, we are going to hand the floor to you in a moment. I'll repeat the question since I'm closer to the mic. I don't know if you heard that or not, Alexis. The question was, you mentioned a number of different species that whose use of the forest changes when ash disappears. Did I get this right? Are any of those species of high conservation concern or threatened or endangered or with similar status?
Yeah, so there's no threatened or endangered species, but there are several species of greatest conservation need and those are designated based on either maybe federal status, national trends, or just evidence in the state of declining trends. And the two, there's one that was commonly breeding and is declining very significantly throughout the range in Minnesota, and that's the winter wren. And the winter wren is a bird species that is really like sort of a structural specialist, and it needs these old growth characteristics where the trees fall down and it responds to nests in these little root balls. And so that's hard to find in a 30-year-old aspen stand. And so it's just kind of lacking on the landscape is what we think. And so they're very common in there. And then another one that actually I didn't talk about, but was observed using these black ash wetlands pretty extensively during migration is a bird called the rusty blackbird. And it doesn't breed in Minnesota, but it breeds in Canada. And it stops over at these black ash wetlands during both fall and spring migration. And it's one of the bird species that have the most rapidly declining trends, and it's designated as threatened in Canada, but not in the United States. And it actually spends more time here in Minnesota probably than it does on the breeding grounds. And so that's a pretty significant and interesting finding in terms of conservation. But yeah, those are the two bird species. For mammals, there was really nothing of conservation concern except for the uniqueness really of the small mammal communities. And amphibians the same. There was nothing of conservation concern there, but again, it was sort of a unique composition of species that was using it.
Yeah.
You mentioned using DED-resistant elms. Do you know what variety of American elm was planted? And then I have a wildlife question too.
Let's just go back to the wildlife one.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I can figure out. I really will. If you give me your information for these questions that I can't answer. Okay. I don't know what the variety is. I know we got it from Kathleen Knight at the Forest Service. Other than that, I'd be guessing.
Okay.
Let's go back to Alexis and ask her your wildlife question.
Go ahead and ask.
Okay. I was just wondering if some of the trees that were planted as potential replacement species, if they have similar wildlife uses as black ash.
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, we were just talking about that this morning, and hopefully that's something we can address in phase 3. But a lot of those replacement species just aren't found in very high abundance in a lot of the stands. And so we don't have a ton of information on them. But really, I think, the overall entire ecological process, if that's maintained, that's sort of what's creating the unique wildlife composition is they're responding to these microhabitats of the gap processes of the sort of wet but not flooded or swamped out sort of microhabitat. And I think, and one of the next things we want to look at too is that the insect communities, so this sort of food web piece within these black ash is really unique. So it's a high value resource for food for all these species as well, including amphibians, because those insects are actually, hatching out of the little wet ponds in there. And so as long as the tree species really helps to maintain that hydrology without swamping out, but provides some wet areas across the landscape, plus we have this sort of succession that's happening in these gap places. A lot of the shrub species are relatively unique compared to the upland, and so that vegetation piece as well. I think that will be the key for maintaining it, and I guess we're hopefully going to be able to do more work to look at how these replacement species grow and how they affect some of those habitat niches that the birds are responding to.
Any other questions?
Rob, I have one more online, since I know you really are enjoying the questions about how and what you planted. If competition is the major factor affecting survival, would planting larger stock at lower densities be worthwhile?
So that's a great question. And that really, there's so many aspects of that type of question that you could get into that we're going to try and explore in this next phase, where it's looking at density. And so maybe it's larger at smaller densities. Maybe it's planting at just really, really high densities, right? It's trying to like overwhelm everything and just get a carpet of anything that can grow, and hopefully it slowly turns into a forest. So yes, potentially, and that's what we'll be looking at. And so a lot of what we're hoping to do in this next phase is actually have manipulations related to competition control, no competition control, browse protection, no browse protection, and so on, to try and tease out some of those really important things that are influencing survival and growth. Ben?
So due to the low survivorship that you're seeing with seedlings and the high cost of planting seedlings, I'm wondering, has anybody considered aerial seeding as a viable option for trying to establish new plant communities in these black ash forests due to the low economic returns from harvesting?
Yes, DNR has, and we're actually working with, I was just talking with Mike Reinekane, another former graduate of the department here, who's the program lead for silviculture in DNR, him and Paul Dubuque. And so they are very interested in looking at that, and we'll probably be working with them closely going into this next phase to see if that can work or not. It's questionable given the conditions that they are, but it's certainly something we got to look at for the very reasons that you pointed out.
You might have spoken to this already, but I was wondering when the girdle trees eventually do have most of them come down, has there been any conversation about how that's going to affect ecologically all the downed wood, and if there's any removal that's going to happen with that?
So we don't know yet, but that's the main case we're making of why they should continue to fund us. We're at this critical point, right? So I mean, again, the main thing, the likely situation is going to be the do nothing, just for the simple issues that I showed you with the extents of the wetlands and the markets and so on. And so understanding what happens when you do nothing is really important. And yeah, we are at that point in the next, Rob asked about how many trees have fallen, maybe 10 to 20%, and we got to get to that point where we get 50, 60, 80% before we really start. But I mean, in terms of, in as much as the microclimate's a huge driver, which it is in terms of the hydrology response and also the vegetation, I would expect it to have huge effects, which could go many different ways. And that's why we want to observe it. So.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Rob again. Yep, and Alexis online.